About a year ago, for the month of June, my family went to France for 4 weeks and left me to tend to the house and take care of the animals. My house is in an interesting location. It is an hour from the campus I go to school on, and a 30-minute drive from my work, and 20 minutes from the main town. My neighbours and I have a few acres in between each other, and the closest house to me is a 10-minute drive. My house is surrounded by farmers' fields, military property, and then miles and miles of BLM land surrounded by mountains. Sometimes I feel like I live in the house from Courage the Cowardly Dog because of how in the middle of nowhere it is and how lots of weird stuff happens in it. If you were to Google what a 2-story house looks like, this would be exactly what my house looks like, except it's 1 story. The second story, where all the windows are, is just ceiling space. There are also lofts in my house where my landlord was going to put the second story but never got around to it. It was like they tried to build a 2-story house but realized that there was nowhere to put the stairwell. There is also a large basement and an attic. I have lived in this house for 8 years and have always felt that the house had a weird layout. Next to my room, there is a huge wall that connects to the living room wall, but my room isn't as big as the wall, so there is just a large wall in between the living room and my room. Underneath my room is the stairs to the unfinished basement. So, now that you understand the layout of my house, you'd understand why there would be a lot of birds' nests on the roof. The birds congregate on top of the room during the summer because that's when the most bugs are out for them to catch, and because we feed our cat just below. My room acts like a funnel for the noise of them scratching on the roof and running around. About 2 weeks after my family left for France, the birds started their scratching noises on top of my roof. They do it every hour or so, all day and all night. It's a very unsettling sound to hear at 3 in the morning, and annoying. But then I started to hear scratching and banging sounds coming from the wall next to me, which is why I thought we had rats in our walls. My mum assured me over Skype that it was probably just birds on the roof, like normal. Over the next few days, I kept hearing the scratching noises and the banging sounds coming from my wall. Finally, I decided that it was time to check the closets and the basement for signs of mice or rats so I could buy the proper traps. After checking the basement, I don't find any signs of mice, so I go check the hall closet, which is the only thing in between my living room and my room. It's usually locked because it's full of a bunch of yard tools and my stepdad's shotgun, my archery equipment, and a handgun. It's locked because my youngest brother could seriously injure himself. I assume it's locked, but I still check the handle, and it opens. I thought maybe my stepdad unlocked it before they left in case I needed a gun to protect myself. The first thing I notice when I open the closet is that all of the tools are moved to the far side, and a portion of the closet wall is missing. At this point, I'm freaking the fuck out and call my best friend and her dad to come over and check it out. I thought about calling the police, but since I live far from a lot of things, I figured me discovering a hole in the wall of my closet probably wasn't enough to send them out. My best friend's dad and brother came over and used flashlights to look into the hole. They don't see anything super weird, so my friend's dad gets on his hands and knees and gets into the hole. When he gets out, he has a look of horror on his face and tells us that he found a dirty mattress, a pair of men's-sized jeans, chicken feathers everywhere, and a whole Walmart rotisserie chicken partially eaten. He calls the police and they search the whole house and find no one, and nothing out of the ordinary. My friend's dad nails a slab of wood over the hole, and I have all the locks changed. The creepy compartment in my closet has since then been sealed up. The scary thing is that because I work during the day and leave the house unlocked most of the time, the guy who lived in there could have come and gone as he pleased until nighttime when I was home. I have 8 dogs, which is the reason my family needed me to stay home, and I never heard any of them bark during the time the banging started, which means the man probably lived in my house a long time, and my dogs got used to him.
Number 6.
I live in a pretty big Midwest city, about 35 minutes north of my hometown. I live in one of the stereotypical not-so-great areas of town, which is fine with me because it's cheap and my neighbors are great. I live with my best friend and his husband. They're high-ranking Buddhist monks. Yes, really. So they travel a lot, which means I'm left alone in my house about 6 months of the year. For the past month or so, I've been experiencing some really strange shit. Not paranormal, but someone is fucking with me. A few weeks ago, 2 of my tires got slashed. Okay, fine, whatever. I have insurance and roadside assistance anyway. A few days after that, my back window got smashed in. I drive a baby Kia Soul, and spray painted across the back was the word cunt. When I walked outside the next morning, I barely noticed it, but the street lamp made it pretty obvious. Needless to say, I was really upset. By the way, I honestly don't have any enemies. I have maybe 5 or 6 friends that I hang out with on a weekly, bi-weekly basis. Other than that, I'm at work or home. So I went to work that day, smashed back window and all, and worked through the longest day of my life. I work 8 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. At about 1 p.m., I got a text from an unknown number with a bunch of laughing emojis. I didn't think anything of it because, you know, that 2016 life, Facebook, Tinder, etc. So I went home without any real worries that night and had some wine because it was a super shitty day. It wasn't until about 8 p.m. that night that I started getting really scared. That same random number that had been texting me sporadically throughout the day, but I didn't respond. Once I was home by myself, I got a text from the same number saying, "You look so pretty and relaxed. I hope you enjoy that book." I was having my 3rd glass of wine and reading a book at the time, so I was thoroughly terrified. I called my best friend, ex-military and super scary. He's been here for a few days now, and I've still had a few creepy texts that only he replies to. It stopped for a day or so, but now we're sitting here in my bedroom, and we just heard someone knock on my door. It's 11:18 p.m. on a Tuesday. My friend went to go check with a gun. As soon as he left my room, someone knocked on my window a few times. I'm honestly not sure what to do now. My best friend can't stay here for weeks, and my other friend won't be home for another 3 months. Edit. I called the police on my way to work today. I'm going to talk to them this afternoon. Edit. I went to the police station last night after work and gave them all the information. Since there's been damage to property and the possibility of this person being in or around my house, they said that it's now an active investigation. I did try Googling the number, but nothing came up because it's a cell phone. Not sure if those are public. And Facebook didn't turn anything up either. After reading through a lot of private messages and comments, I tried to dissect my life as much as possible to think of who this person could be. I've narrowed my list down to only one person. I gave their name to the police as well. Hopefully, this ends soon because I'm ready to move on with my life and not be terrified of my own home. Thank you to everyone for all of the kind words and great suggestions. I'll let you guys know if anything comes up. Edit. After going through my life, like I said before, I think that I've narrowed it down to someone that I had a short, no-commitment relationship with about 4.5 years ago. He tried to contact me about 6 or 7 months ago, but I wasn't interested in having him be a part of my life again. He not only knows where I live, but he knows where I used to live as well, my parents' house, because he's my mum's next door neighbour. The police haven't been a huge help. I'm not sure what to do now. If it is him, I'm not just scared for myself, but my mum as well. Number 5. So, for the past few weeks, my sister's been complaining of hearing what she calls a phantom radio coming from her closet. She says she can hear it on and off throughout the day when it's really quiet in the house, but that it's a near constant thing throughout the night. It sometimes plays music. She can't quite tell what kind, but she says she thinks it's kind of a bit like old-timey jazz. She says she can hear trumpet or saxophone melodies. Other times, she claims that she can hear talking like it's a radio show. She says there's definitely a man's voice speaking, but it sounds like he's having a conversation with someone. She can't make out what's being said. The way our room's set up, our closets share a wall, so we've both dug through our closets from top to bottom, trying to see if there was maybe an old MP3 player or radio that ran on batteries that could be making the noise, but neither of us have anything like that in our closets. I can't hear anything from my side either, but I have heard it while in her room. We can track the noise to the closet, but it never gets any louder or clearer no matter how close we get. She says that when she gets too close, it just stops, but it'll start back up again when she moves away. It's keeping her up at night. She's taken to sleeping on our living room couch sometimes because she says the noise is constant. And just as she's getting used to the music or the talking and is able to tune it out and fall to sleep, it'll change and wake her up again. She says she feels like it knows just when to do it to keep her from falling asleep. Last night, she slept in my room with me. Now, we're two grown women. We haven't shared a bed in at least 15 years. But last night, about 2:45 a.m., she burst into my room and dove into my bed with me. She was shaking and crying and more terrified than I've ever seen her. She said she was in her room trying to sleep because it was quiet for the first time in a week. She was just about to fall to sleep when she heard it start up again. It was talking this time, and on reflex or out of irritation or whatever, she looked over into the corner of her room and glimpsed at a dark shadow. She says as soon as she saw it, it moved or disappeared, and she couldn't quite tell if it was in her room or outside her window. We have huge floor-to-ceiling windows on one wall of our rooms, and she couldn't tell what side of the glass it was on. As soon as she told me, we peeked out my window, which is about 5 feet away from hers, but we couldn't see anybody or anything. We're pretty sure that if it was someone outside, we would have heard them moving around in the leaves and sticks and stuff outside our windows. Plus, we don't think that there was enough time for them to get away from the house without us seeing them. Our house sits on a pretty big lot and it's a lot of open land, so there's nothing for anyone to hide behind or anything like that. I don't really know what to do or what to say to help her. I haven't personally experienced anything except hearing the radio when I've been in her room. We haven't had anything weird happen in any other parts of the house either, as far as I know. I'm a skeptic by nature, so I'm inclined to think that her mind was playing tricks on her last night, but she's positive about what she saw. I have absolutely no explanation for the radio noises. Have any of you heard about anything like this happening? Or do you have any ideas about what we should do about it? Any advice would be greatly appreciated. Number 4. In August, I moved into my first apartment. I graduated from university, was offered a job as a teacher, and was well on my way to figuring out this whole adult life. I moved in with a longtime friend and neither of us had any complaints about our apartment complex. Our complex is really nice. It's not in a wonderful part of town, but it's truly a diamond in the rough. The complex is well maintained, clean, and other members have been nothing but friendly. If you live at the apartments, you are given a remote that opens the gate of your choosing, but if you don't live at the complex, you have to go through a directory at the front to find the name of the resident you are looking for. once you have found the resident's name, it appears as last name, first initial. It calls the resident's phone and gives the resident a few options. The resident can choose to talk to the person who has called them and decide to let them in by entering in their key code in the dial pad on their cell phone, or they can hang up and the gates will not be opened. Overall, I think this system helped to save me from this situation I got myself into. One night in October, I was driving home from my fiance's house. It was late at night, probably close to 2 a.m. I had just gotten off of the freeway and was about to enter into my neighborhood when I was stopped at a traffic light. I was in the left-hand turn lane and there was one other car in the right-hand turn lane 2 lanes away from me. The light changed to a green arrow and I proceeded to turn left, and the car, which had previously been in the right-hand turn lane, maneuvered to follow me. I thought this was weird because of how many lanes they cut across, but I figured that they were lost, so I tried not to think much of it. I continued driving down the road and was about to make a right-hand turn into my neighborhood and was distressed to see that the car turned in behind me. Still, I ignored my gut feeling and figured they lived in the neighborhood around my complex. I remember thinking that they were driving just a little bit too close, but again, I tried not to let my anxiety get the best of me. I do have high anxiety, so I figured it was just my brain playing tricks on me. I remember from hearing stories on here that the best way to tell if someone is following you is by turning right multiple times to form a square of sorts. But I talked myself out of this maneuver. I wish I hadn't. I sped up just a bit, clicked my gate open and pulled into the complex. Again, I convinced myself that this was normal. They probably lived in the complex too, right? The gate opens on the opposite side of the apartments, so you have to drive through the entire complex to get to where my apartment is. I drove through quickly. I was prepared to exit the complex just in case the person was still following me, but when I looked at the straightaway right behind me, I realized that there weren't any headlights following me anymore. I laughed at myself for being so nervous and pulled into my parking lot in front of my building. As I parked and prepared to get out of the car, I turned for one last look and realized that the car that had been following me had reappeared with their headlights off, and they parked in an unreserved spot just a bit down from my own. I knew that I should have turned my car back on and drove away. I knew there were so many other things I should have done, but in a moment of panic, I jumped out of my car and ran up the stairs and into my apartment. I double-locked the doors, grabbed a knife and ran into my room to call my fiancé. I heard someone shouting from outside, which is very unlike my complex. It's very quiet. But I refused to listen to what they were saying as I told my fiancé what had just happened. I suddenly heard more voices shouting, and then it was silent. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I remember not being able to stand because my knees were shaking so much, and I tried to stop myself from crying so I would be able to see if someone broke down my door. My fiancé made it to my apartment in record time with a baseball bat for me to help ease my mind. He stayed that night and let me sleep with the lights on. I couldn't get the sound of screaming out of my head. It was obvious they were calling for someone, and I figured that it must have been me. I assumed the other person screaming must have been another resident who was trying to make the other person be quiet during the early morning hours. I figured the whole situation was over until I woke up in the morning. When I walked downstairs to my car, I discovered that one of my tires had been viciously slashed to ribbons. I then realized that I had left some mail with my name on it in my car in my hurry to exit the night before. I didn't think much of that detail until later. I got my tire fixed and tried to push that night out of my mind. A few days later, however, I started to receive calls from the directory in front of my building to let someone in. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I answered and asked who was calling for me. I was met with silence, so I hung up and didn't grant access into the complex. Again, I was called and the same procedure was repeated. And again, no one answered. They called obsessively from the call box directory for days. I finally snapped into the phone for them to tell me who they were, and a man answered. He told me that he lived in the complex and needed to be let in because he lost his key. He told me that he lived in the apartment next to me. I knew the family who lived next to me. There was a woman with 4 children, but no man. And if he really did live there and lost his key, he would have been able to call himself to open the gate. I told him I didn't believe him and hung up just as he started screaming at me to let him in. And the calls continued. I marched to the office the next day and asked them to take my number off of the directory. The man was unable to call me now, and I felt at peace. I warned the office about the man who had damaged my car, and they increased security rounds in the complex for a few months. As anticlimactic as it is, that was the last contact I had with the weirdo, thankfully. I know how I handled the situation by not listening to my gut when it told me something was wrong, got me into trouble. I allowed someone to follow me and learn my name, and they were able to torment me for a few weeks before I finally took action. I am just thankful to my fiancé and the staff at my apartment for taking action to help me stop the creep from being able to contact me.
Number 3.
So, about 2 years ago, my family and I moved to a quiet neighborhood in the city we live in. It was really nice, good neighbors and nothing to complain about. Well, every now and then, my mum would take my dog out with her when she did the yard work. He is a black lab and is very protective, especially of my mum. One day, a scraggly looking guy came walking down the street, and when he got in front of our house, my dog freaked out. He even chased after the guy, which he never does. He mostly just keeps to himself in between us and anyone he's not familiar with, and will occasionally bark if they approach too quickly. After that happened, my mum apologized profusely, and after she tied my dog up, the man went on his way. A few days later, the same thing happened with the same guy. Again, my mum apologized and the guy left. After this happened another 2 times, my mum was really irritated and refused to take my dog out with her when she did the yard work. After a week, she once again took my dog out with her, thinking he would be fine. Well, the same thing happened. My dog freaked out, my mum apologized, and the guy left. At this point, my mum was really pissed at my dog and would only let him out if he was tied up, or me or my dad were there to help keep my dog away from people, even though he only freaked out at this one guy. Well, a few weeks went by and there was no sign of the scraggly wanderer. Then, one morning, my mum was reading the paper, and there was Mr. Scraggly. He had killed 2 girls in their early 20s about a block from where we were living. Moral of the story, get a murderer detecting dog like mine.
Number 2.
For the past 1 year and 9 months, I've been living alone and 9 hours away from home due to my job. I'm not the most social person. My gym manager and a few stray cats aside, I haven't made any friends in this city. I'm generally fine being alone, but after almost 2 years of solitude, and with Ramadan approaching, a usual festive and family-orientated time in my country, even I began to feel a bit lonely. So yesterday afternoon, as I was about to get off work, I started to contemplate my dreadful return to my empty flat and thought perhaps that it wouldn't be a bad idea to get a flatmate or move in with one. I'd actually been thinking about this for a few weeks. I got my phone out, quickly found a few ads and saved some numbers. Once home, I decided to call one I had saved as Mehdi Rent. Mehdi was apparently the landlord's name. He was renting out the still available room in his 2-bedroom flat. He sounded like a decent guy over the phone, and we decided to meet up near the supermarket in a few minutes, as I couldn't figure out the exact location of the flat. Still in my office attire, I headed out to meet him and was in front of the supermarket 5 minutes later. Some 15 minutes went by and there was still no sign of Mehdi. I called him again to let him know I was still there, and he confirmed that he was on his way. Soon afterwards, he showed up and greeted me with what seemed like excessive delight to me, the way you might greet someone you actually know and haven't seen for a long while. He proceeded to make small talk and then casually asking a bunch of stuff I assume any landlord might ask. Examples of this were, "I'm guessing you're not from town. Are you a student? I look younger than I am. What do you do? Where are you from?" Stuff like that. I felt like he was being a bit overbearing, but thought nothing of it. Several awkward responses later, I asked if we could go see the flat. His smile changed into an inquisitive frown for the briefest moment before he resumed his exceedingly gleeful attitude and said,
"Yes, of course."
I started walking behind him, and as we turned around the corner, he gestures to an old Renault 19. I had no idea he'd come by car and had assumed we were walking to the flat since it was supposed to be close to the supermarket, so I was surprised. I'm a ridiculously trusting person, and displeasing people is almost a phobia of mine, but I was hesitant to get into the car. It wasn't out of concern for my safety. I'm just from a conservative society, and as a young woman, it would be really inappropriate to get into a car alone with some random dude I just met. Being a fellow member of said conservative society, I'm sure he knew this as well. He seemed to notice my discomfort at the suggestion, but asked me to get in anyway, and being generally unable to say no, I complied. As he drove, he attempted more small talk, but I was super uncomfortable and only responding with short interjections. I had my phone in my hand and I got some notification, so the screen lit up. It just lit up with a small vibration, no sound, it was on silent. I didn't even check it, but along with my disposition, it seemed to have annoyed him greatly. His weirdly upbeat attitude dissolved in a moment and I was sternly ordered to put my phone on the back seat. At first, not knowing how to respond to this, I gave him an incredulous look. Seeing his lack of reaction to my disbelief, I thought maybe I am being rude. So I started to put it inside my handbag, but he was adamant I put it on the back seat and repeated the oddly specific command. I'm somewhat alarmed by the unwarranted fervor at this point and decided to keep my phone in my hand instead. So I timidly replied, "No, I'm fine," which wasn't enough to deter him. He brought out his own phone, turned it off and turned it to me to say,
"See? Now put yours on the back seat."
I essentially ignored him because I didn't know what else to say or do. We had been driving for maybe 3 minutes, so I asked him if we're near the flat and he said yes. Another 2 minutes or so went by. I'm starting to get really nervous, and I ask again to get the same response. Then I ask if the woman occupying the other room wouldn't mind the visit, which was probably a silly question, but I just wanted to find out whether she would be there, seeing as I wasn't keen on being alone with this guy in a flat. His facial expression morphed into the same inquisitive look he had assumed earlier, and he remained silent for a second before saying that she wouldn't mind. I thought nothing overly suspicious had happened so far, but I was getting overwhelmed by a terrible sense of dread for whatever reason. Something about this man just didn't feel right. This feeling was shortly confirmed when he caressed my hand. I got startled and instinctively flinched away, then finally mustered up enough courage to ask him to stop the car. Instead of stopping, he put a firm hand on my thigh and flatly told me to calm down. Further internal panic ensued, but I tried to keep my outward composure and asked him again to stop the car. I was ignored and he kept attempting to touch me. I was absolutely freaking out at this point and thinking I should just jump out of the car because God knows where this creep is taking me and what might happen to me. This was a car from the 80s and you had to unlock the doors manually by pressing or pulling the lock. I looked at my door to check and it was unlocked. We were thankfully coming to an intersection with a stop sign where he'd have to slow down to almost a halt. So I thought this was my chance to get out. I'm still trying to get his hand off of me as the car starts to slow down. Meanwhile, my phone starts vibrating in my hand and I look at my screen. Initially, I was confused and couldn't comprehend what I was looking at, but no words can describe the sheer terror that overcame me when I saw the caller's name, Medi Rent. For a fraction of a second, I was just paralyzed by the chilling realization that this guy was even more of a stranger than I'd thought, that he had likely realized at some point that I thought he was someone else, yet decided to pretend he's actually who I thought he was anyway, to keep me in his car. The car had slowed down considerably when I stepped out of my stupor, opened the door and bolted out like a rocket. I started running out of sheer fear and shock, but slowed down to walk when I looked back and saw that he didn't come out of the car. He had just completely stopped, stayed there for a while, then slowly drove away. I got back to the supermarket and met the real Medi. I had called my gym manager and friend meanwhile, and we waited for her to arrive. I wasn't going anywhere alone with anyone after what had just happened. We saw the flat, which turned out to be nearly in ruin and nothing like the one in the picture. So I went home, still terrified and with no prospect of companionship. This just happened yesterday, so I'm still overcome with panic when I think about what this guy might have had in mind. I think it's time for me to seriously learn to say no and just generally stop being this dumb.
Number 1.
My childhood home was a grey stucco house that sat on a 2-acre lot. It was built in 1917. My mum once ran into an 80-year-old woman who told us our home was known as the neighbourhood's haunted house during her childhood. I know that these kinds of rumours are common when you're a kid, but the longer we lived there, the more we began to question if those claims were really just stories from children's imaginations. All in all, we have spent about 16 years in that house and have taken away several creepy experiences. Some have logical explanations, but some just don't make much sense. If you were to step inside this house, to the right you would see the stairs to the second floor and a door to the living room on the left. The living room is adjoined by the dining room, followed by the kitchen. The kitchen leads to a small hallway on the right which has 3 doors: Jason's room, the bathroom, and directly across from Jay's room was my brother Aaron's room. This particular event happened to my brother, Jason. He was about 13 or so at the time. One night, my brother was having trouble sleeping. For a while, he tossed and turned, trying to get comfortable, but ultimately gave up and just sat there, looking around the dark room. Then, he heard soft footsteps pattering around somewhere in the house. At first, he thought that it could be our dog or cat, or maybe just a figment of his imagination, but as he listened, they grew louder. Now, the footsteps were deliberate, heavy, and almost angry or frantic, and they were getting closer. He could hear the steps thud through the living room into the dining room, and the closer they got, the more the floor shook and the windows vibrated. When it came pounding into the kitchen, the sounds halted abruptly. At that point, it seemed to turn around and stomp back into the living room. Then again, the heavy thuds came banging into the kitchen, stopped short, and reverse. It repeated this pattern about 3 times. Once more, he heard this thing race back into the kitchen, but this time, it didn't turn around. A shadow passed in front of the doorway and raced into the bathroom. Then, silence. My brother tells me that at this point, he felt like his heart was about to explode out of his chest. As he stared, wide-eyed through the darkness, he saw a shadow lean around the doorway. Something was peering into his room, looking straight at him. He couldn't make out a face or any defining features. As he stared at this thing, he saw that its head seemed to be leering around the doorway at an odd angle. He realized that it was floating sideways. He tried to scream, but nothing came out. Then the shadow dashed back into the living room, and everything went silent once again. My brother jumped out of his bed, hyperventilating, ran into Aaron's room and shook him awake. My other brother claimed he didn't hear anything. Same for me and my mum upstairs. He listened to music in my brother's room until he was able to calm down. To this day, he still doesn't like to talk about this story. My mum rationalized that maybe it was her checking up on him that night, but honestly, none of us believe that. The sounds and just the way the thing looked told a different story. During the time we lived there, I had some of my own experiences, but whatever it was, it seemed to go easy on me. This story never fails to give me